Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology, and this is a special video that I've made called The Spiritual Purpose of Astrology. So if you're watching this, it's likely that you're receiving this as a gift from my recent Kickstarter campaign. I just want to start off by saying a big thank you for your donation. I really appreciate it. And I'm so thankful for everyone who pitched in and helped to make this year of 2019 successful in terms of the daily, weekly, monthly production of a lot of new astrological content. So the hope and goal of this video and the motivation that I had in making it is to talk at a little bit more length and in a little bit more depth about the spiritual purpose of astrology and how we see that purpose illustrated within the views and texts of the ancient astrologers and throughout different historical eras. So I'm going to go ahead and share a PowerPoint now. So let's make this big. Okay. So I've made this so that you can follow along a little bit more easily. Let's start by just putting it this way. There's not just one spiritual purpose of astrology. There are many. But in this talk, it's my goal to explain some of perhaps the most important reasons that we do astrology for the sake of spiritual growth. This is not to suggest that a spiritual purpose for astrology is that there's only one spiritual purpose, or that there aren't other purposes for astrology that may not have to be spiritual in nature or not necessarily of the nature that I'm describing in this talk. I want to try to remain as open-minded as I can, but I also think it's important to try to articulate what the most universal spiritual purposes for astrology were and continue to be, especially when looking at the source texts of ancient astrologers. And I'll also try to share in this talk my own realizations and insights after doing so many readings over so many years now. And I consider myself still, really, I'm finishing up almost the first decade of my career. I consider myself very young as an astrologer. So any of my elders who are listening, you have to excuse my youthful hubris here. So the spiritual purpose of astrology is obviously an ongoing conversation. I also reserve the right to evolve and grow myself in my understanding of these matters. But what you have in this talk is kind of a distillation of some of the main insights and realizations that I've had in my practice over the first decade of my practice. That's the gist of what we're going to talk about. And again, I'll draw on source texts as we go. So starting off, when we say the spiritual purpose of astrology, we have to ask what we mean by spiritual. And I think this is a fair starting point. So when you look at the founding astrological theory, what you notice very quickly is that there is a very clear divide being made, not only in the esoteric philosophy of the source texts, but also in the philosophers of the day with regard to spirit and matter. So how can we define the difference? Well, I think it's very basic. It's sort of like saying almost all religious and spiritual traditions around the planet, from Native American to nomadic civilizations to Eastern and Western civilizations, have believed in the life of the spirit or soul. That is to say that you go on living after your body dies. And so there is a distinction between some essential element of who you are and the temporary quality of the body and flesh that you occupy. We see this in Buddhism. We see this in yoga. We see this in Taoism. We see this in Islam, in Christianity, in Judaism. We see this in so many traditions and in so many different ways and walks. So that's the spirit matter distinction. it's not to say that matter is not sacred, that it's bad or wrong. There have been a huge variety of beliefs and views in different religious and spiritual traditions about the spirit and matter distinction. Why do we come into bodies if we don't stay in them? How do we know that we're a spirit soul? How did we get here? Is it a good thing that we're here or a bad thing that we're here? So this opens up, in a sense, the spirit matter distinction is a feature of a huge variety of different metaphysical, spiritual, and religious traditions. For example, Buddhists do not handle the topic of spiritual life in the same exact way that yogis do. Christians handle it a little bit differently than Jews. We have Native Americans and different shamanic traditions that handle these differently as well. So I don't want to try to make this, overly simple at the cost of eradicating beautiful religious diversity that we have, in our world, to become interested in. There's different ways that the spirit matter distinction, in other words, may play a role in our lives. But there are some things that are sort of perennial, wisdom and beliefs and ideas about spiritual life that recur in many traditions. And so let's try to talk about those a little bit. Different religious and spiritual groups have usually emphasized that one of the key features of this distinction between spirit and matter is that we can grow or become ignorant of it, which means that we can mistakenly think that all that I am is this temporary material existence. All that I am is this moment by moment hunger that I feel. Give me this, give me that. I want this, I want that. Lusting after very temporary forms of happiness that don't really feed the life of the soul. So almost all religious and spiritual traditions have taught us that a spiritual life is about recollecting something of eternal, enduring value that doesn't come and go, that's not fleeting, that doesn't die, that isn't in a sense born and that doesn't die. It's said by many traditions that that's actually who we are, that we are eternal spiritual beings, and that we are also a part of an eternal spiritual reality, a God, or again, different traditions have different ways of conceptualizing it. And so the purpose of spiritual life, again, in many traditions, is to try to find our sense of who we are and of what brings us happiness in that which is eternal and enduring, that which moves through all of the fluctuations and changes of the material world and the changes of our body, including birth, disease, old age, and death, that moves through those things with a vivid, awakened sense of spirit, of spiritual consciousness, of eternality. So that's the best way that I know how to break down what most spiritual religious traditions around the planet seek to emphasize. And then there are practices, there's liturgy, there's all sorts of different ways of trying to keep that connection to spirit, soul, awake and alive. The artist may do it through dance. The monk may do it through prayer, recitation of scriptures, right? There's so many different ways and practices that help us to stay connected to that eternality so that we don't get lost in ignorance, which causes cyclical suffering. So practices become very, very important. Now, we see the spirit-matter distinction, and we see the emphasis on the study of astrology as a spiritual practice very early on in the history of astrology. So, for example, we have Plato, who is thought to have been one of the major inspirations for the cosmology of astrology, meaning the if astrology is kind of like a very early form of like a physics model for the universe or for reality, like string theory or something, the cosmologists who created astrology or who received it, it was said, for example, that Nechepso, who was thought to be one of the founders of astrology, received astrology in the middle of the night from a voice in the heavens, right? The mythical founder of astrology is said to be Hermes, perhaps real, not mythic. The inspiration that comes to the early cosmologists, however, is thought to have been inspired or come from very similar philosophical thinking that was present in the Platonic Academy, Platonism. Now, if you don't know a lot about Platonism and Pythagoras before Plato and the Greek philosophical tradition, it's influenced by a wide variety of different philosophical schools of thought, many of which are come from the Persian occupation of Babylon, and that happens just prior to the advent of Western horoscopic astrology. And that Persian occupation of Babylon allowed for a huge influx of different peoples and thinkers and scholars and mystics to come together into a kind of melting pot. And so you have many interesting parallels between Eastern philosophy and early mystical Western philosophy that are thought to have come about through this kind of interesting melting pot era. That's something that I'm going to be presenting on several times at conferences, actually in 2019 this year. So maybe there'll be a time in the future where I will say more about that. But for now, what we can say is that this kind of Platonic thinking is inspired by the East by the West. There's a lot that's shared in common. In Plato's Timaeus, which is one of his treatises on cosmology, Plato explains the motion of the one and the motion of the other, or sometimes referred to as the primary and the secondary motions of the sky. And these motions form the bedrock of astrology, because they are the basic motions of the heavens that are fundamental to the entire language of astrology. So, for example, the primary motion of the sky carries everything in the same uniform circle over and over and over again, 24 hours a day. Planets rise in the east, they culminate up above, they set in the west, the stars along the zodiac follow the circle, and the procession goes round and round. And this is due, of course, we know, to the rotation of the Earth on its axis. But it's very important to note that Plato saw this uniform motion of everything in the heavens, which was the fastest motion. No planet can overtake this motion. It's not fast enough. This motion carries everything, stars and the planets, separates day and night. That motion was connected to the one, to that which is eternal. Plato said time is a moving image of eternity. So this movement is a kind of reflection of that which is eternal, that which doesn't die, that which doesn't change, that which isn't just temporary, that which doesn't just come and go. This time-moving wheel, this great circle, is a reflection of that which does not change. Because although it's moving in a constant circle, the circle itself is whole, and the movement unceasing is a reflection of eternity. So time is the moving image of eternity. Then we have the secondary motion of the planets. Now, these Plato equated with the circle of the other, or the circle of the different, the circle of the many, or the motion of the other, or the realm of coming to be and passing away, which all of the planets participate in, because in all of their idiosyncratic cycles, speeds, luminosity variations that they display. They move against the grain of the primary motion. So the planets appear to move through the zodiac, the stars out in space, very, very slowly in the opposite direction. They move from west toward the east, whereas everything by the primary motion is being carried from rising in the east to setting in the west. So this distinction gives us two different motions that are opposed to one another. And this is very much, by the way, like the thinking employed by Taoists in the I Ching, when we see the circle that holds the opposites. So the realm of the same, or the uniformity, is denoted by the primary motion of the sky, spirit, that which is eternal. The realm of matter, that which comes and goes, is represented by the fluctuations and constant cyclings and idiosyncratic differences and diversities of the planets. This is the realm of the many. And in that realm, the way that things work is in also cycles, but fluctuating between opposites. So in this material world, we're young and then we're old. We're healthy and then we're sick. We're good and then we're evil, right? It's hot and then it's cold. Everything here fluctuates, changes, demonstrates impermanence, and fluctuates between opposites. So that was the basic observation that Plato made about this material realm, and said that the material realm contains within it a reflection of the eternal, but is not the same. It's like a copy. So similarly, the Bhagavad Gita describes the material universe as something like a banyan tree with its roots upward and its branches downward. So it's a kind of mirror image. And we see that this material world is, in a sense, a reflection of a spiritual world. That's a value in the yogic tradition. Platonic tradition, it's very similar. The person who is a prisoner in the cave sees reflections of shadows on the wall, just like Neo in the Matrix thinks that his everyday life is real, only to find out that there's a different real world that's outside of this false world of appearances, a realer world. And Plato believed the same thing. When the person takes up a philosophical or spiritual journey, they start to question the nature of the shadows. You look into the pond, you see a reflection of a tree on water, and you realize, I think that's a reflection. I don't think that's the real thing. Or it's like the real thing. It's not exactly the real thing. You get out of the cave, you see a fire was creating the shadows on the wall. You get all the way out of the cave, you see the light of the real sun in the real world. People who are in the cave might kill you because they may be so bound and determined to continue in the delusional belief that this is all that there is. Well, think about what's happened to many of our great spiritual leaders, people like Martin Luther King Jr., who wanted to elevate consciousness, or Gandhi, or people like Nelson Mandela, or just people who have been in some ways trying to elevate the human spirit. Oftentimes they're antagonized. Or we have people like Jesus, right, who's killed, or you get the point. Often are people who provoke us to think and see beyond the dim shadows of this world and all the temporary, unsatisfying qualities of this world, which so many people are lost in, are considered to be a real threat. This is part of how the delusion and ignorance of the world is maintained, because people who have a vested interest in staying connected to the illusions of this world will do everything that they can to keep out anyone who tries to point our attention or awareness to something higher. So astrologers have always been controversial, because we're here to help people see Saturn in the midst of your divorce, or we're here to help you see Jupiter in the midst of that time in life when you feel like you're growing or expanding your knowledge, or growing your faith. We are here to help people see the eternal in the midst of the mundane and temporary and fleeting. We're here to help people see the archetypal and the eternal in and through our lives and relations and events and everything. That's what astrology has always been about. And it starts with these two motions in the sky, the primary motion and the secondary motion, and this sort of Platonic, it's Neoplatonic, it's Indian, it's Taoist, it's so many different traditions take up very similar line of thinking. There are some interesting differences. For example, in Buddhism, a Buddhist may say that this realm and consciousness itself, all baseless, substanceless, and what lies beyond cannot be spoken of, can't be conceptualized whatsoever. Somewhat different trajectory, for example, the Christian story, or even certain yogic traditions like that found in the Bhagavad Gita, will say, no, this world is real, but it is a dim reflection of the spiritual world which we're trying to return to, or which we're trying to awaken our consciousness to. Maybe it's here already, but we're trying to awaken to it. And a kingdom of heaven is spread before you, but you do not see it, that kind of thing. Or the kingdom of heaven is something to be reached only when we start to reorient our awareness back to spirit and away from the temporary identification with the worldly things that are impermanent. So the different traditions have different ways of trying to deal with these things, and I hope that's all I'm trying to illustrate right now. However, what's clear is that, again, astrology in its very most basic astronomy, the cosmological foundations of astrology, have a lot in common with Plato's idea of the one and the many, the spirit and matter distinction, and the two motions of the sky, which he related to the zodiac and to astrology in Timaeus. And we know that, Plato was thought to be deeply, he was someone who had a great impact on the founders of astrology. And I don't think this was articulated anywhere better than in Robert Schmidt's writings and lectures that he gave for two decades plus through Project Hindsight, and all of his work as a Greek scholar and translator of the ancient Greek source texts. So, but again, I think it's important to note that the Greek and the Eastern really blended a lot. I want to say that because it's not just a Greek thing. All right. So we know as also that the study and practice of astrology was not simply to get information about things that would happen to you. That the study, the real deep cosmological understanding of astrology was just as alchemical and spiritually oriented as yoga or Buddhism or any of the other great spiritual moksha traditions. Moksha is a word that means liberation or release or something like that. And so the idea of being chained into the world of appearances and to think that that's all there is, that astrology quite clearly is participant in trying to help liberate people from that, or at the very least, although it offers prognostications about the future, the true devotee or student of astrology is not as much interested in getting all tangled up in outcomes as they are about the study of destiny and the study of reality. That astrology is a part of, it's more like a sacred physics that was being studied. A byproduct of which is the ability to prognosticate. So we have to be very clear about this, that astrology embodied the spirit-matter distinction, that, however, that as a discipline in and of itself, it was aimed at the similar goal of liberation from ignorance. And that means that while not everybody who's practiced astrology at any point in history has only purely been interested in spiritual realization, that the intention of the founders was most likely such. So let's go on. Almost all spiritual traditions around the planet suggest in one way or another that in order to learn how to stay home in the heart, that's the language I use, centered in transcendental consciousness, we have to practice being in this consciousness or cultivating it regularly, because we tend to get covered in layers of ignorance, delusion, sleepiness, etc. So in order to cultivate that kind of awareness, we have to stay in regular practice. For example, Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which are one of the most universal user's manual for yogis. It was very ecumenical, non-sectarian, for the people kind of text during its time. Practice becomes firmly established when it has been cultivated uninterruptedly and with devotion over a prolonged period of time. Practice becomes firmly established when it has been cultivated uninterruptedly and with devotion over a prolonged period of time. So you have to imagine that this is not unique to Patanjali, that this is a feature of all great spiritual practices and traditions. I imagine Thich Nhat Hanh would agree with that statement. Mindfulness can't really take hold and give you the fruits of the benefits of the practice unless you practice it regularly over a long period of time with devotion. Similarly, in order to cultivate spiritual life, I think Plato probably would have agreed that one has to be relentless about the pursuit of truth. Plato was very passionate about that. Similarly, we see people like Mother Teresa, who dedicated her life. I went and saw her convent in Calcutta last year, and I'm going again in next month. And one of the things that was said about her in the different memorials and shrines that were there dedicated to her was that she was relentless in prayer, that she prayed constantly, and that her prayer filled her with the desire to go out and help and minister to those who were suffering, to give them physical help, but also to give them spiritual help. And so devotion, consistency over a long period of time. Astrology doesn't work on us, spiritually speaking, most of the time, unless we devote ourselves to it over a long period of time. So astrology is a spiritual practice like any other, but it has to be cultivated over a long period of time. And the cultivation of our study of astrology is not mostly about our interest or anxiety about things that are going to happen in the future. Astrology's predictive power is, again, like a byproduct of the spiritual study of astrology. I'm going to try to articulate this and flesh this out a little bit more in a few minutes. So astrology can be something that, like any other great practice, can help us to cultivate that spiritual awareness. The spiritual awareness that we cultivate is the happiness that we seek. It is the freedom that we seek. It is the outcome that we seek. And yet it is not in a sense of this world, because it can be in anything and move through everything in this world, because it comes before this world and it comes after this world, right? So the thing that we're seeking to cultivate within our hearts, within our minds, within our lives is not ultimately tied to any outcome, not to a good one, not to a bad one, right? Nothing like that. So if the study and practice of astrology is to help us cultivate that kind of consciousness, we need to ask, how does it do so? How does it do so? And we also have to be careful of the ways in which it may keep us from cultivating that. So having a philosophy about spirituality, no matter how broad-minded or creative or inclusive it may be, is fruitless if we don't have a regular devoted spiritual practice. I use this because sometimes I think that astrology takes the place of a kind of spiritual outlook, a mental or intellectual philosophy that we have. Well, I believe everything is sort of being guided, by higher intelligences, and we come up with there's a lot of philosophizing. And what I noticed about great spiritual practitioners of all traditions is that their philosophy is most evident in the way that they live their lives and practice what they believe. And so that's something that I really take to heart in my own life. I fall short of it often, like regularly, but it's something that I try to be very persistent about my own spiritual practices. But the point of saying this is that we can conclude that astrology is only useful for spiritual life if it accompanies spiritual practices or itself becomes one. So I don't think astrology is typically enough on its own. I think it usually has to be accompanied by other spiritual practices for it to really become a spiritual practice. I think the temptations for astrology to become a distraction are many. And so I think if astrology is not paired with regular devoted spiritual practice, that it is not different than a lot of other kind of spiritual fetishes that we have that aren't really being put into practice. So I don't want to be too critical here, but that's my belief, and that's why I think it's very important that we talk about how can astrology be accompanied by spiritual practice, and then how can astrology become a spiritual practice of its own. Let's go on. In order to deepen this idea that I'm presenting here, that astrology in the beginning, I believe, was a spiritual practice. There may have been a wide variety of different ways in which astrology was understood as a spiritual practice, and we've seen that it can be an add-on to a lot of different traditions: Buddhism, yoga, Christianity. We see a lot of different, Islam, again, Chinese people had forms of astrology. So we know that astrology can participate in a huge variety of different religious or spiritual traditions or experiences. But I think by looking at some of the source texts, you can get a feeling for what ancient astrologers were thinking about and what they believed the purpose of astrology to be. And so let's look at the mood of our ancestors, our sort of astrological elders right now in some of the source texts. We can see how astrology should be approached for the sake of spiritual growth. So I'm going to read you a variety of different passages. I just want to give you the mood for them. So here's Marcus Manilius, one of the earliest texts that we have available from the Roman era of astrology, Roman Hellenistic era of astrology. By the magic of song, he's a poet, to draw down from heaven God-given skills and fate's confidants, the stars, which by the operation of divine reason diversify the checkered fortunes of mankind, and to be the first to stir with these new strains the nodding leaf-capped woods of Helicon, as I bring novel offerings untold by any before me. Now is the heaven the readier to favor those who search out its secrets, eager to display through a poet's song the riches of the sky. It is my delight to traverse the very air and spend my life touring the boundless skies, learning of the constellations and the contrary motions of the planets. But this knowledge alone is not enough. A more fervent delight it is to know thoroughly the very heart of the mighty sky, to mark how it controls the birth of all living beings through its signs, and to tell thereof in verse, with Apollo, that's the sun, tuning my song. So what's the mood you pick up on there? First, that it's a beautiful divine thing to study this science and to understand the fates and to see destiny and to understand this kind of divine science and again to see it play out in our lives, to predict things, to see the heavens being able to describe internal experiences that we have. But then it goes further. More important is it to know the heart of the sky. In other words, to establish a deep, personal, heartfelt connection to the intelligence behind or within astrology. That's that spiritual consciousness. This is the earliest source text we have in available to us that's not a later compilation from an earlier period. So that's Manilius. Let's look to the east. This is the Graha Sutras. This is the first shloka. The supreme unborn spirit has had many descents. Janardana, in the form of the Grahas, rewards the fruits of the karma of the living beings. And this is the author's purport. In Vedic astrology, a planet is known as a Graha, which means seizing. A planet is called a Graha since it seizes man as well as all other things and puts upon him his astrologically fated destiny. Grahas are, however, much more significant entities than mere tools of destiny. The true import of the Grahas is given in Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. In this sutra, Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra tells us that the Grahas are nothing but aspects of God, and that the purpose of these aspects of God is to bestow the results of man's and other creatures' actions. The term used to signify God in his taking the form of the Grahas is Janardana, the one who agitates man, causing fear and worry. No doubt ill-disposed Grahas give us much to fear and worry. However, we should remember that the Grahas themselves are aspects of God, and thus we should not fear them irrationally any more than we should fear God. Nor should we fear that which they bestow any more than we should fear that which God bestows upon us. Yet, since the fruits of our actions are often undesirable, we may often find ourselves fearing Janardana and the Grahas. So the next sutra tells us the benefit of the Grahas so that we may understand that they are here to help us and that indeed we have no need of fear. So this is the beginning of one of the, sometimes called the Hindu Bible of astrology. And again, a very ancient, very old astrological source text from India. And the text is explaining that the planets and the way that they orchestrate the destiny of human beings is according to a divine plan and out of love and affection for us, even though sometimes it appears very scary, and fate in this world and events in this world often seem incredibly heavy. So again, but feel the mood of why we're doing astrology, right? What is the purpose? Again, it has to do with being able to see the divine in the midst of life and to not fear what we experience and to not get overly attached to what we experience because the Grahas sees us. So that's another very good one. I'm going to read a few others to you that just give you the mood. This is from Masha Allah and Abu Ali. These are Persian astrologers. Now, first he writes down everything in a common place, then also he indicates how it should be done. But even in what order one must judge through individual chapters. He's talking about this textbook he's about to lay out. For under the testimony of him who built this inestimable construction of the world, and those things had in it, both here and above, out of kindness alone, the shining orbs of the stars and the wandering retreat of the moon, for certain comforts of humankind, and for educating, or rather training, the ignorance of men. So there it is again in the Persian astrologers. This is a Jewish astrologer, Abraham ibn Ezra. He starts off his text, The Beginning of Wisdom, astrology, famous astrology text in the medieval period. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, for it is the instruction. For when a man does not follow his eyes and heart to fulfill his worldly desire, then wisdom will rest in him. There it is. Listen to that. Very, very, very precise thing that all these astrologers are saying in different ways. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, for it is the instruction. For when a person does not follow his or her eyes and heart to fulfill his worldly desire, then wisdom will rest in him. Moreover, the fear of God will protect him from the laws and ordinances of the heavens all the days of his life. And when his soul separates from his body, it, the fear of God, will endow him with eternity, and he shall live forever. So here I shall begin to interpret the laws of the heavens according to the rules as practiced by the ancients generation after generation. And after I complete this book, I shall compose a book of interpretation of reasons. And to God I shall pray for help. Amen. Now, this is a Jewish text, but it's saying essentially the same thing. And we have to understand is that this word of fear that he uses is not fear of a monster. What we're talking about, the word fear, often used in religious and spiritual context, is that which is bigger than us and fills us with awe and reverence, and yes, also terrifies us. But the terror is one often of immense beauty. So similarly, in the 11th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, when the universal form of the Lord is seen by Arjuna in a trance, he is overwhelmed by the beauty to the extent that he is also terrified. And this is the kind of, just to be clear, because it might sound a little heavy to some people's ears, you have to remember that there is, I drank ayahuasca for about 10 years, a lot of very deep and intense psychic experiences and visionary states. And some of them are incredibly terrifying, but they're not terrifying as in, a monster who wants to smash you to pieces and is some kind of tyrant who's trying to, who's an insane person. Instead, we are talking about, in these visions, you have the terror of how vast and big and unfathomably vast the universe and reality and the divine is. And keeping that our littleness, keeping that in perspective, having this reverence, that's said to be here a part of the attitude that one should take in and through the study of astrology, so that this spiritual science might become a blessing and a protection from all of the events of life. And let's be clear that ancient astrologers believe that one could just as easily be tempted out of that place of consciousness and happiness and freedom and eternality through good events, seemingly good events, just as much as seemingly bad events. So, if someone gives you something and you get all like, yeah, woohoo, it's like, ooh, be careful. You can fall off that horse really quickly, and it can really hurt. So when you receive something good, most of us are pretty modest about it. Wow, thank you. It's really amazing. But we don't get all like I'm just so, yes, I got this thing. Or when something bad happens, we grieve, but we don't say, well, this is the end of me. Where do we get that wisdom from? What's the same thing is we're trying to stay in the center because we're being taught to not get lost in the extremes, because we should have a healthy fear of those extremes and getting lost in them, which overestimates our size and the scope of things. It does not mean that we are not each sacred beings to have a healthy, sacred kind of fear of things. So I always like to clarify that for people, because thankfully I grew up in the church with a father who was a Venus in Pisces and very, very poetic, and he often had a way of helping me to encounter, like going for walks in the woods at night under the stars. In the wintertime we would snowshoe, and he had a way of helping me feel the vastness and the danger and the excitement and the beauty kind of all at once. That's how I take Ibn Ezra. Here's William Lilly from the Renaissance. William Lilly is, let's see if I can get to his, I had it pulled open. Let's see. This is to the student in astrology. My friend, whoever thou art, that which with so much ease hast received the benefit of my hard studies, and doth intend to proceed in this heavenly knowledge of the stars, wherein the great and admirable works of the invincible, or maybe it's invisible, invincible and all glorious God are manifestly apparent. In the first place, consider and admire thy Creator, and be thankful, be thou humble, and let no natural knowledge, how profound and transcendent forever it be, elate thy mind to neglect that divine providence by whom all order and appointment, all things heavenly and earthly, have their constant motion. So again, just you can feel where the reverence of the astrologers is going. And again, some of these are people coming from India, some of them are Christians. They're, all walks of life really coming to a very similar place. I'm going to read you a few more. This is going to be kind of the extravaganza of ancient astrological reading here. All these things are conferred upon us by the courses of the stars. Fortune destroys us in these diverse ways, meaning the body, whence warned and formed by so many examples and so many reasons, we may thus prove the law of fatal necessity, not by license of arguments, nor by an abundance of words, but rather by the credible and right judgment of truth. But indeed, those same ones who were contradicting this allegation of ours do agree to some extent, saying that there is certainly some force of fortune or fate, which they call heimarmene, but they attribute certain things to this necessity by the license of their own disputation, which same things the law and the necessity of the fates contradicts. And so it seems that it both can and cannot do anything. For that which they call heimarmene, they wish to be conjoined to the nature of man and the other living creatures by some kind of association. Because we are made and begotten in such a way that living for a certain time and having completed the course of life, we are born back from that unyoked fragility of body to that divine spirit who sustains us. We are obliged to complete that end by fate and likewise by lot. So he's getting into a philosophical tangent at that point, but the thing that I wanted to emphasize was that here's Firmicus becomes a Christian eventually, but he's sort of a pagan prior to, and I believe he was more of a pagan when he wrote this. I don't mean pagan in a derogatory sense at all either. He's suggesting that the law of fate is necessary to acknowledge. And as we do, we can also acknowledge that we are a spirit soul who, upon death and the realization of our destiny or fate in this world, can be rejoined to the divine spirit of everything. So again, same kind of deal. All right, here's another one. Same author, slightly different. What sort of life and what sort of practices astrologers ought to have. Now you who venture to read these books, these are his instructions on astrology, when you have received all the knowledge of divinity and when steeped and initiated in the secrets of nature, you have come to know the system of the sacred work. Shape yourself in the image and likeness of divinity so that you may always be adorned with the commendation of goodness. For it behooves him or her who daily speaks of the gods or with the gods to shape and instruct his or her mind, so that he or she may always approach the imitation of divinity. Wherefore both learn and pursue all the ornaments of virtue, and when you have instructed yourself therein, be easy of access, so that if anyone wishes to learn about something, talking about their fate or what's money going to be like next year or whatever, he or she may approach you with no terror of trepidation. So he's saying, astrologers, make yourself in the image of the divine. That's what this whole science is actually coming from. And be easy of access to people. This is, when I read this for the first time, this was one of the foundational passages that helped me realize that I wanted to do a huge amount of my work to the public for free and then ask for donations at the end of the year. That I prefer to make the bulk of my income in that way, because that way people can approach this sacred science and also approach the spiritual truth behind the mighty heart of the sky, without any kind of fear that they're not worthy of it, which often money prevents us from. Be chaste, righteous, prudent, content with a small living and with small means, lest the ignoble greed for money defame the glory of this divine science. He goes on and on for a long time. It is easily one of my favorite passages in all of astrology, coming from Firmicus Maternus. And then at the end, he says this: therefore be pure and chaste, and if you have separated yourself from all nefarious actions which are wont to destroy the mind, and if a right vow of living has freed you from all hatred resulting from evil deeds, and if you keep yourself purged of evil and mindful of the divine seed, then enter upon this work and commit to memory the following books, so that divinity may bequeath the whole science to you, and draw near to your mind with a hidden prophetic majesty, so that, having attained the true knowledge of divinity in defining the fates of men and in explaining the course of life, you may be instructed not so much by those things you have read, but rather by your own mental judgments, so that more may be conferred upon you by your divinity of mind than by your mastery of what you have read. So there he is. He's given it to us straight up. The ultimate purpose of astrology for Firmicus Maternus there is not so much about what you read in charts or books. That's a part of it. But so that in time, divinity may come to inform the way that you see the world and the way that you make choices in the world. And that you start to shape your life and your intelligence in imitation of the divine. And that, more than just prognostications, judgments, theory, craft, houses, planets, signs, blah, blah, blah. This science is to lead us there, to making us wiser and more intelligent, sort of spiritually speaking. So I love that. Let's read a few more. I just really want this to sink in, and that's why I'm laboring it a little bit. So this is from Vettius Valens, one of the early Hellenistic astrologers. For God, in his desire that man should foreknow the future, brought this science into the world, a science through which anyone can know his fate, in order to bear the good with great contentment and the bad with great steadfastness. Accordingly, then, the initiates of this art, those wishing to have knowledge of the future, will be helped because they will not be burdened with vain hopes, will not expend grievous midnight toil, will not vainly love the impossible, nor in a like manner will they be carried away by their eagerness to attain what they may expect because of some momentary good fortune. A suddenly appearing good often grieves men as if it were an evil. A suddenly appearing evil causes the greatest misery to those who have not trained their minds in advance. He says, those who engage in the prediction of the future and the truth, having acquired a soul that is free and not enslaved. What would enslavement be? It would be thinking that this is all that there is, and I'm really only interested in outcomes in the material world. They do not think highly of fortune and do not devote themselves to hope, nor are they afraid of death, but instead they live their lives undaunted by disturbance, by training their souls to be confident, and neither rejoice excessively in the case of good, nor become depressed in the case of bad, but instead are content with whatever is present. Those who do not desire the impossible are capable of bearing that which is preordained through their own self-mastery. And being estranged from all pleasure or praise, they become established as soldiers of fate. So he's a kind of a stoic. Firmicus says, the study will most successfully bring us to the point where our souls will despise everything which is considered evil or good in human affairs. For when we learn of the approach of difficulties, we despise the threat of evils because we have learned from our doctrine about things to come. We do not shrink from dangers once foretold. By recollection of its majesty, our souls have formed themselves to withstand these things. We are not overcome by bad fortune, nor elated by promise of high office. Thus fortified by stable reason, we cannot be oppressed by ill fortune, nor overjoyed at the expectation of good. Ptolemy. For, first of all, it is necessary to consider that even for events that will necessarily result, the unexpected is apt to cause delirious confusion and mad joy, while foreknowing, this is what astrology allows us to do, habituates and trains the soul to attend to distant events as though they were present, and prepares it to accept each of the arriving events with peace and tranquility. Here's another one. This is from Zoisimos. Hermes and Zoroaster say that philosophers as a class, this is also a reference to astrologers, are superior to fate because they neither rejoice in her good fortune, for they are master over pleasures, nor are they thrown by the evils she sends, as they always lead an inner life, nor do they accept the fair gifts she offers, since they look to an end of ills. So what does that tell us? Again, each of those passages, all of them really are saying the same thing. And we just went from the early Hellenistic period of the Indian, Persian, medieval, Renaissance, the whole kit and caboodle. We just went through all of it. And you see this repeated. This does not mean that all astrologers have only and ever practiced this way. Just like today, we don't necessarily all practice this way. But the general mood is that of the study of astrology taking us closer to the spiritual intelligence behind it, within it. And the practice of astrology, though interested in the prognostication of fate and destiny, becomes less and less concerned about it as it goes along. If that is not the result of our study of astrology, then it will not finally be a spiritual practice. If, on the other hand, we gradually proceed in that direction, then it indeed will be a spiritual practice. But even then, as I was saying earlier, I don't think that it works unless it is wed to other spiritual practices that are more experiential and everyday. Because a lot of the times the study of astrology shows up in the most profound moments in our life don't happen every day. And a lot of the times astrology's real spiritual teachings come through the big events, but we also live very mundane lives where we're doing things like, kind of like itching our butts and taking showers and eating food and like just having a daily grind. You know what I mean? So that's why I think we also need other spiritual practices. Now, some people will immediately be like, yeah, that was all like nice to hear about the tradition, but like, we've evolved so much. We've come along so much. We're in a new day, in a new era. Now, I grant that we are in a new day, in a new era, but every day is a new day in a new era. And things also endure. And there's a relation between the new and the old that's also eternal in this realm. It's another dichotomy. It's another duality. Have you ever spent long quality time with elderly people or elder practitioners or elder wise men or women who have seen a lot and experienced a lot? A lot of the times they are much less sort of eager for some particular outcome and more accepting of whatever the outcomes might be. And that does not mean that they are devoid of free-spiritedness or youthfulness. So it's the quality of our consciousness that makes something new. It's the quality of our consciousness that makes something free. So even though some of these texts people will read retrospectively, sort of project the era of oldness onto them and say, well, that feels really fatalistic and heavy, and like we should just resign ourselves to the cyclical miseries of the world and try to focus on something that's otherworldly, feels like a little bit of spiritual bypassing to me, feels kind of fatalistic and heavy and whatever. But no, for me, when I read Manilius the poet, when I read Firmicus Maternus, and when I read these other passages, I hear within them echoes of something archetypal. That is, that freedom and great youthfulness and great joy and great happiness are not purely defined by whether something is old or new. And I hear them telling us that great freedom and great joy and great happiness is not also found in things being ultimately always in our control. That if we aren't always in control, and if we have to deal with a fate and destiny, things that are out of our control, that it's specifically our willingness to surrender to the reality of fate and destiny that becomes a gateway to immense and unmeasurable joy and freedom as well. It's a bit of a paradox in that regard. But astrology is a tradition where we have elders. And I don't know any other tradition on the planet, any discipline where elder voices tend to be ignored. For example, if you want to learn if you want to learn how to build a house, you don't just say, well, I'm going to do it a new way, and so I don't need anyone to teach me. You look for teachers who know how to do it. Similarly, you may then invent some of your own things, but you'll start having to learn it from people who know how to do it. Similarly, astrologically speaking, no matter how advanced we may think our sort of new era of astrology is, to me, it's very important that we respect where our tradition came from philosophically and spiritually speaking. And there's nothing to me in these texts that suggest that these ideas aren't just as valid and deep and beautiful and inspiring today as they were 3,000 years ago. Also, astrology's power to tell the future helps us to shift our attention from the use of our actions in the material world, getting things we desire, toward using our time and energy to cultivate the richness of our consciousness. So, for example, I'm just going to give you a very simple example. A lot of the times when people come to an astrologer, in the very beginning, they're only concerned about what's going to happen to me. What's my life going to be like? Reflecting maybe some level of anxiety or attachment to what's going to happen. It's pretty normal. It's pretty human. Astrologers don't sit down with clients and condescend and tell them that they should not be interested in those things. No, we read for them and we tell them, well, this period of time is going to be Saturn-like in this area of life. This period of time is going to be Jupiter-like in this area of life. Stuff like that. But what does that give a person? Is it just like, oh, good, great, I'm going to get a promotion. Oh, okay, that time might be a little bit more tough. Okay, good to know. Now I can go and, continue to trip out on everything like that. No, that's not why we're giving them that information. It's so that when the Jupiter period happens and they get elated by the promotion, and then the elation eventually dies off, or when they go through the difficult Saturn period and the difficulty is deep and hard, and then eventually it wears off. Somewhere inside of us, we start to realize after a couple of these astrological experiences that, like, oh, wow, these are just like passing rainstorms in my life. They're like just as regularly changing and I guess in some ways predictable as the weather. When we start to embody the reality of astrology through our lived experiences, through the prognostications of an astrologer, which hopefully will be accompanied by some advice on how to walk through the experience with greater awareness or greater consciousness. But even more than that, because all too often when we think about giving people advice for a transit, a lot of the time it devolves into, here's how to navigate this transit to get something. Not the point of astrology, really. If we're talking about how to experience a higher consciousness while going through the mundane events that the transit will most likely bring up, that's our karma, in my opinion, then that's a great thing. But if we're saying, well, go and navigate this transit so you can get something out of it, that's not such a good thing. When we do astrology in this way, and we have these kinds of experiences that shed light upon the nature of material reality, that's when we start to see, oh, This world is like a shadow play. And we start to think there must be something higher, because the astrology implies a higher intelligence behind all of the seasons and fluctuations of life, which ultimately aren't the point because they are somewhat predictable. And we don't like things that are predictable because we have a sense, we have an inkling that who we are is free, is not predictable, is variant. We don't like cliches. We don't like predictable outcomes. So when astrology does that for us, it's like a homeopathy. It's giving us a taste of exactly what we don't like, but we tend to be really anxious and attached to in ignorance. And then by going through it, we say, oh, wow, there's something more. There's something higher. And it brings us from being like all out here, like that, and it brings us back into a prayer position. It brings us back into, wow, what is this? There's something more. There's a higher intelligence. Most of us don't live with the feeling that we are bigger than the planets, right? Most of us don't live with the feeling that we are in control of everything after having experiences where someone says, hey, Saturn's entering your fourth house and there's going to be some difficult things happening with your family or your parents or your property, or maybe there's a focus on Saturn in the fifth house and you're trying to get pregnant. It's really difficult. Or maybe you're going to have eclipses in your ninth house and travel to a distant country. When astrology tells you that these things are going to happen in these different areas of life and you go through those experiences, and then you kind of go, well, I wonder what's going to happen next. And then you continue to see it playing out like that. You go, wow, so there's like a higher intelligence behind this. There's a method to the madness, and you start becoming interested in that. And how do I cultivate a relationship to that? And all of the changes of the material world and all of the investment that people have in them, you start to distance yourself from, not in some way of dissociating, but rather in a way of not being possessed, not being thrown out of your center. Just like the planets, remember, are called grahas, grabbers, seizers. You say, oh, okay. So then the question becomes how to cultivate and stay in that sense of freedom. A shift in consciousness starts to happen or can happen. This is where cultivating a spiritual practice along with astrology really, really helps. Chanting, prayer, meditation, mindful walking, sacred scriptures, exercise that's not goal-oriented, hiking, journaling, quiet time to simply reflect and be still, peaceful music, a peaceful diet, enough water and sleep. Increasing your time of commitment to these kinds of activities slowly over time, and starting with manageable activities. Time alone, having the right kind of people in your life, the right associations, the right sanghas or spiritual communities, peaceful or private environments. You learn as you go not to multitask, not to put things off, not to avoid things, not to fill your life with too much clutter or busyness, because that's when you tend to get lost out there. And then when you go to astrology, it's all about what's going to happen, what's going to happen, what's going to happen. Astrology will give you the answer. But the point of giving you that answer, again, is so that when it does happen, when astrology is able to describe the flow of the Tao, when astrology is able to describe the way that things are going to unfold, not always perfectly, but in symbolic terms, in archetypal terms, then suddenly, like once again, you're like, oh, yeah, that's right. I keep getting lost. I keep thinking that this is all that matters. I need to reprioritize. So slowly over time, our priorities change. This is why, again, I think that I'm giving this list because I'm suggesting that if astrology is doing its work, these activities should start to fill our lives. If they don't, then it's my feeling that astrology is falling into the beware territory. What's the beware territory of astrology? Astrology, like any other technology, can be used to help spiritualize our consciousness, or it can be used in a spiritual kind of costume as a way of deepening our attachment to worldly outcomes. In that sense, it's used sometimes more like a black art or a black magic. I don't mean it in any like super nefarious or like evil way. I just mean it becomes another way of it becomes another strategy for material, temporary and fleeting material stuff. And insofar as astrology is being used in that regard, I I do believe that it is not the spiritual purpose of astrology. Now, that may sound really judgy to some people, but I feel at the end of the day that that is the only ground that I can stand on in truth as an astrologer. So I have to put it that way for myself anyway. Now, I want to give you an example. Last night, this is January 6th, last night, January 5th, on the evening of a solar eclipse in Capricorn, just a couple of degrees off of my natal moon in Capricorn, just as Saturn is coming into a conjunction with my natal moon in Capricorn, I received the news that my grandmother was moved into hospice care and is now preparing to die. For at least a year, I have looked occasionally. I don't look at my chart that often, but maybe I look at my chart once a month. That honestly, if I'm looking at my chart once a month, I'm pretty happy. There are phases I go through where I obsess a little bit more, but over time, more and more, I don't look at my chart as much. I check in. I'll talk more about this in a moment, but I looked at the chart and knew for over the past year or so that very well Saturn over the moon could indicate death of women or death of mother or death of grandmother. Knowing my grandma is in her 90s, I thought very logically could very well be her time to pass. So as Saturn is just a degree off from my moon, and as the eclipse is coming over my moon, I received this information from my family that my grandma's been moved into hospice care. When I take my spiritual practice alongside of my astrological practice, in the past 24 hours, as I have been mourning this and feeling it and processing it in human ways, not trying to bypass my humanity here, but as I have been feeling it, Saturn and the moon and eternity have been with me. And I say that in truth because that's my practice. And we can realize that. And that therefore death is no longer just death. My grandmother is a spirit soul. But this event is beautiful and spectacular, right? I mean, how beautiful is it that astrology could predict with such precision and accuracy the death of a matriarch, the death of a grandmother, Saturn, old, and the decay and the winter coming right over the moon, the lunar, the feminine, the goddess, the mother, an eclipse happening right there, south node of the moon. Like it really, if you can take it in from the perspective of your eternality, it's like, wow, that's beautiful. And what does it do? What is the benefit of it for me? It helps me remember my grandmother's okay because we're hanging out in eternity here. Do you know what I mean? And I'm going to be okay, and it's all okay. And it also helps me just go in my grieving. The grieving becomes transcendental. It becomes spiritual. It's not that grieving goes away, that oh, I'm just bigger than grieving. It's that it becomes spiritual grieving, which means it's multidimensional. It's transcendental. Sometimes we believe that in order for it to be enlightened, we have to do away with all different kinds of experience, as though I'm not a real person, you're not a real person, the world isn't a real thing. But many ancient philosophers, many yogis, and the Bhagavad Gita explains this, the Bhagavad Purana explains this, Plato explains this, that this world is also thought of as a reflection of the spiritual world. And so if I remember that all the diversity of experiences here is actually all spiritual in nature, then, and if I can shift my consciousness to realize that, then nothing here any longer has to be such a drag, including grief. Did I have control over this? No, right? Like I didn't have control over this. This is the hand of destiny. This is the respect and love and awe and reverence that all of these astrologers I just read were talking about. And they were saying that if you study astrology, then moments like this come to pass. And over time, it's not so much the books and the theory, it's these events that happen that impress upon you the truth of divinity. And then it comes into your heart, and astrology becomes a way of celebrating it You don't care anymore what's going to happen. You're not just blindly running around as though you're a cog in a wheel either, right? So you start learning how to use your freedom in life, the limited freedom that you do have within the field of activities that you're born into, determined in some ways by your karma and forces that we pretend to understand. You start using your free will. I start using my free will to spiritualize my consciousness. If I have free will, then by God, help me to use it so that I can realize who I really am and be in service to the whole of which I am a part. And we cultivate that through spiritual life. That's how we use our free will. That's the only thing that free will in this world, the use of material free will, makes any sense for. This material world of time and space gives temporary appearances of limitation and mortality. So long as we rail against that and try to conceptualize who we are or our freedom within the framework of just material time and space, we will only find a limited temporary use for our freedom and a limited understanding of who we are. So we have to figure out a way of using whatever free will we have within whatever limitations we're confronted with by fate and by destiny and by the nature of material life to spiritualize our consciousness. That's what we're tasked with. It's hard to do because, as many different spiritual teachers have said, leading our egos, our temporary sense of self, to the water of spiritual nourishment is difficult. It's like leading a bull to water. They need the water, but it's hard to do. It's hard to lead our egos there. You don't lead an ego there by telling it it's heinous and evil and bad. If you do that, like it's my child. If I tell her not to do something, she's going to want to do it more. So how do you kind of coax and bring along that part of you that wants to remain chained in the cave of images and appearances? Right? The ego often wants to kind of try to totally sabotage us if we do anything that's good for the awakening of our consciousness. So so the Bhagavad Gita says the mind is the best of friends and the worst of enemies. So most of what we resist about astrology and much of the distortions of astrology come from an inability to surrender to forces and powers bigger than ourselves, starting with our own higher self, whose real interest is in how we experience this life and whether or not we cultivate our consciousness and stay awake for the journey of life. We should not see an astrologer out of obsessive anxieties. We should not see an astrologer at all if all we are going to do is continue obsessing about the future. Rather, we should see an astrologer to help alleviate our anxieties about the future, not because we're going and hoping that they'll tell us the thing we want to hear, but we're going because we want to hear the truth, and we want the truth to bring us back to the center of surrender, to the center of where our real freedom really lies. We should remember that astrologers are interpreters of the will and intelligence of the divine and are fallible. And we should have hope and faith kept in our heart at all times, no matter what astrology tells us or doesn't tell us, without being that hope and faith being connected to an expectation about a future outcome. Like, well, I have faith that eventually I will get the job that I want. Well, I have faith that eventually I will get the marriage I want, or faith that I eventually will get the body that I want, or the whatever. Our faith and hope should be faith and hope in the nature of who we are and what is real. And that if we take that into our study of astrology, we will always come out pleased, because astrology will keep delivering for us the affirmation that we're not alone, that we're being guided, that there's something bigger than us, but that also lives in us and with us. And that the scale, in a sense, of the big and the small is irrelevant once you start developing a heart-to-heart relationship with the sky, with the divine majesty of all that is. If we see ourselves as servants, part and parcel of the divine, then our lives take on the direction of the heavens. And that is where we find our truest alignment, our true nature, and our eternal happiness. So thank you very much for listening to this. I hope that this talk is inspiring and that it may help you clarify your own reasons for doing astrology or provoke some interesting philosophical thoughts in your mind. And again, I don't consider this talk to be the final word or anything more than the sharing of my own realizations and what I love most about the history of astrology and what I consider to be its spiritual intention. So thank you again very much, and I hope you have a very beautiful and blessed 2019. Okay, take care.